on today's episode of Retrial Podcast.
Well, they say the law in its majestic equality permits both the rich and the poor to sleep under bridges. And in this one, this poor guy was sentenced to die in the electric chair on December the 30th, following the September event.
So he's sentenced to the electric chair before the end of the year.
Yeah.
And this incident happened in September.
Pretty fast work, huh? And the
speedy trial.
I think something needs to be said about the lawyers who represented him.
Yeah. Welcome to Retrial Podcast, where we decode legal history that happened in Dayton, Ohio. These cases, lawyers, and stories set the stage for present-day learning across our nation. I'm one of your hosts, Judge Gerald Parker.
And I'm Dave Greer, the other one.
Oh man, this episode is our final episode, Dave. This has been fantastic. This is our last one. I'm kind of sad, I'll be honest with you. I want to keep this going.
Well, we just hope some of the people looking at this are going to be sad about
it too. That's true. They're going to be happy or sad that we're wrapping these things up.
Oh, thank God it's over.
God, I ain't got to watch these guys anymore. So we're going back in time almost 100 years to talk about a case in which a black man was charged with killing a Dayton policeman in 1927, specifically September 18th, 1927. Should I go through what took place at that time?
Well, I don't think we should leave them guessing. Let's give them the bare facts.
All right, let's go. So,
Dragnet.
At 2:30 a.m., here's the facts. On a dark September night, a black man, Roy Freeman, is sitting in an automobile which is parked on a downtown street in Dayton, Ohio. Dayton police officer asks what the defendant is doing, conducts a search of his vehicle, and finds a .32-20 revolver. Good so far?
Yeah.
All right. Mr. Freeman, the defendant, exits the vehicle, and there is a discussion between him and the officer, Officer William Horn. Is that correct?
Correct.
All right. During that discussion, there's a gunshot. An eyewitness who is some distance from the participants saw the officer thereafter and saw the officer thereafter fire a whole series of shots at the fleeing defendant, again being Roy Freeman. The officer dies of a gunshot wound to the heart. The evidence indicates that the officer's weapon had never been fired, and that all of the bullets came from the gun, which was found in the defendant, Mr. Freeman's vehicle, was also in the possession of the officer when his body was found. Later, there would be a confession that was signed by the defendant, but the defendant refused to admit that he had made the statements attributed to him in the confession. That is the global umbrella version with a lot of facts to be discussed herein.
It sounds like the kind of thing that seems to be happening just about every day since 1927.
When I say police shooting, when I say black male police shooting, everyone's antennas, I can only imagine, go up. So Dave, I don't know where to go. We can go in a lot of different places. We've talked a lot about race riots of the summer of 1919, and this is not even 10 years later. We're still in the heart of Jim Crow. We are still seeing the great migration of black people coming from the South. We're also seeing the Ku Klux Klan having a little bit more of a presence in these areas.
Big time, yeah, in the 20s. From 23 on, huge Klan rallies in Dayton and burning crosses and all that stuff. At least they expanded their horizons, so they were after the Catholics as well as black people. But I don't know if that's much of a compliment to them. That September turned out to be a bad month too for emotions.
Tell us about that month of September in 1927.
There was another shootout that had a Dayton policeman killed in a confrontation with another black man. That didn't result in much of a trial because the black man got killed, but so did the policeman. And then there was.
You say the black man got killed. What do you mean?
The defendant didn't quite make it to the courthouse for the trial.
Understood.
And then there was another one where a group of black young men in a railroad boxcar killed a railroad policeman, all in September that year. So it was lynch time in Dayton,
Yeah.
and the speed with which this case hurtled into a trial and a conviction is almost phenomenal.
Let's talk about. We have to stop right there because the incident happens September 18th, 1927. The indictment in which an individual is formally charged happened when?
19th.
Like almost not even 2 days later.
Yeah.
He's indicted. And if I'm not mistaken, we haven't gotten there yet, but the trial was within 20 days.
Yes, in October, early October.
And I don't know, folks who may not who are listening who are not as much involved in the criminal law or in the legal process we have murders that have happened in 2020, 2021 that are still being worked on by officers and may not have been indicted until this year or coming up next year because of the investigations, because of the police officers making sure that their evidence is tight and they're just not indicting too soon. So an indictment to come in 2 days later and then a trial to happen, around 20 days later, not even a month later, is absolutely insane.
Well, they say the law in its majestic equality permits both the rich and the poor to sleep under bridges. And in this one, this poor guy was sentenced to die in the electric chair on December the 30th, following the September event.
So he's sentenced to the electric chair before the end of the year.
Yeah.
And this incident happened in September.
Pretty fast work, huh?
And the speedy trial.
I think something needs to be said about the lawyers who represented him.
Yeah, tell us about that.
Because here's the defendant, Roy Freeman, has no money. There are no public defenders. All criminal cases are done by appointment. There weren't very many black lawyers in Dayton at the time, but two of them were appointed to defend Mr. Freeman. One of them was Gil Waiters, who was a very nice man. He didn't start practicing law until 1925, so this is 2 years into the practice. Mm-hmm. He continued to be a lawyer in Dayton until quite some time. Mm-hmm. I think mid-1960s, he was still a lawyer here in Dayton. Very, very nice gentleman. Not a tiger of a trial lawyer, but the other lawyer was a tiger of a trial lawyer. John Jetton, his name was, and we're going to let the cat start to slip out of the bag. Mm-hmm. There's going to be a second trial here someday.
Well, wasn't there a plea at some point? Wasn't there a plea? Didn't Mr. Freeman at some point, where he was kind of moved towards a plea towards guilt?
They talked about that, mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And but they went to trial within days of the incident. Appointed, and there you are. What are you going to do? And Jetton did a wonderful job of protecting the record, which is a real trial lawyer's job, because there were several legal errors that occurred in that first trial that should not have occurred, and he had the courage to make an objection because they had a judge that wasn't exactly Roy Bean west of the Pecos, but it was close to it at the time.
Yeah, let's can we navigate through some of those decisions that judge made?
Yeah, I think because that's part of what makes this case so interesting, because it's going to end up with a second trial, but without the efforts of Mr. Jetton, there would have been no separate trial because you got to have your objections and then you got to protect the record. First big problem in the trial is they asked to have the jury instructed on lesser included offenses. It was tried as just a straight capital case. Wow. And the judge refused to give them a chance to give him a break on the sentence. So that created an error that the Ohio Supreme Court ultimately said required a new trial. The other thing that's even more alarming is the judge just went off. I mean, in instructing the jury, he made comments about the worst crime that can ever be committed on earth is to kill a policeman and blah, blah, blah. Right. But went way beyond what the law was and just made it quite clear that he was going to be one really unhappy judge if this man wasn't found guilty. So that created an error. And, you know, when you've got to stand up there with a judge like that and say, Judge, I object to the comments that you have made, and I need to make a record of that.
Right.
You're risking getting yourself in a bit of a bind.
Absolutely.
And unless they have a nice, dispassionate judge like Judge Parker.
I was going to say.
Yeah.
Yeah. This guy obviously didn't know what he was doing. How did he get on the bench? You know?
Well, he'd been on the bench a long time, and he was on the bench a long time. And he's well known. And in fact, he ultimately became a dean of the UD Law School back in the old original law school days.
Wow.
Tried a lot of murder cases, but in those days, things were quite different from the way they are now. And that's one thing we'll have some fun talking about.
So, Dave, we got the global picture, and as you know, facts are important. The specifics are important. Even though we claim that we know everything that's happening based off of social media and Twitter and Instagram, that's where we get our information on all these news sites. But, you know, when we delve into the weeds here, who was Roy Freeman, and how much do we know about him, and how much do we know about Officer Horn, William Horn?
William Horn was a beloved officer of the Dayton police with a good record as a policeman. Freeman was a barely literate man. He'd worked, I don't know whether it was a sharecropper or something like that in Tennessee.
I have to stop you right there. He came from Jackson, Tennessee, which is where my mom was born, Denmark, Tennessee, which is like a little country town within Jackson, Tennessee. So I've been to Jackson, Tennessee, and Denmark, Tennessee. So when I saw that Roy Freeman was from there, I was like, wow.
Okay, brings it home.
Brings it home. There's a lot, and Jackson is really, really quiet, and Denmark is even more quiet. It's out in the middle of nowhere, very, very, very much of a rural area. But I spent a lot of time in Jackson, Tennessee. My mom went to HBCU, Lane College down there. So both my parents went to segregated schools. So, like, you know, seeing another Jackson, Tennessean coming up through was pretty cool.
Okay, well, you were talking about the diaspora. Well, up from Jackson, Tennessee, he came to Dayton.
That's exactly right.
Not long before this event.
Right.
And what happened was he was out what he called joyriding with some friends, had dropped off the friends, and the car broke down. And he was trying to check his car, and he stopped at like 2:30 in the morning on a Dayton street. And the next thing you know, here comes the cop, and kind of, what are you doing there? If we put it into modern,
We could easily do that.
modern times, what do you do if your car breaks down and it's the middle of the night, early morning hours, and a policeman comes up to the car and says, "What are you doing?"
Can we add that it's 1927 and not like 2027? That's
Well, let's do it both ways.
yeah.
This was 1927,
Right.
which is a little different from today.
But there's some similarities.
There are some striking similarities.
Yeah.
And the next thing that happens is the policeman does a search of the car and doesn't really find anything, except then he finds that the defendant is sitting on a gun.
Right.
3220.
Right. Yeah. Which gets us into, of course, legal issues as far as probable cause, and that's where the facts start coming in as to where we would go today. I mean, my antennas are already raising because I already see a suppression issue coming down the pike. And then we get on to the confession, we already see another suppression issue
Yeah, so
coming as well.
in modern times, you would have an immediate motion to suppress because it's an illegal search, or the argument is that it's an illegal search. And I guess the facts of it are maybe nothing ever would have happened but for that search and seeing that gun.
Another fact that I find is, or another part of this that we're trying to navigate through is who shot who, and we know what was used, what gun went off, but one could only imagine, and of course there was likely only one person to live to tell about it, was the fact that who's holding the gun when and at what point in time.
Yeah, there is a witness that's relatively close by, named George Pappas. And he claims he hears, "Stick up your hands or I'm going to kill you." In the first trial, he says that's what the defendant said. In the second trial, under cross-examination by Albert Scher, who was a heck of a lawyer, he says, well, maybe that was the policeman that said that.
Right.
And then there apparently is a little tug of war over the gun.
Understood.
And there's a single shot, and several witnesses hear a single shot and then 5 shots in succession. The 5 shots are apparently the shots that are fired by Horn at the defendant who's running away from the scene.
Right. Who was hit, right? He was hit by a bullet, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, one mistake the lawyers made in the first trial was claiming that, yes, he claimed that he was shot running from that scene, whereas in fact the evidence made it pretty clear that where he got shot in the leg was when they arrested him the next day on the grounds of the state hospital we visited in Herb Eikenberry's day.
Yeah.
So Freeman runs from the scene. He'll at trial claim that he was shot in one of those shots that when he was running away, which hurt the credibility of his case with the jury, I think, because it became very clear that the shot that went through him was shot when they arrested him the next day. It's actually the same day in the afternoon. At 2:30 in the morning is the death. He runs away. He makes it to the grounds around the Dayton State Hospital, and the next morning, a crowd finds him there. Here come the police, and here comes hundreds or thousands, we don't know, of people. One of the early things about criminal justice in Dayton, and I suppose every place else, is in the days before television and other forms of entertainment, when there is a shooting, everybody shows up. I mean, it was a terrible job for police because the crime scene would all be trampled up by all the citizens seeing what's going on. But at any rate, he's accosted in the field. He's shot in the leg. He's thrown in the car. There's a big question of whether and to what extent the cops beat him up on the ride from the field back to the station house.
And this is typical. I mean, this is not something that just happened in this case. These types of things were happening across the nation as it pertains to black defendants, white victims, right?
Absolutely. And the next thing that happens is the, quote, confession that they get from him. There's an old blind Willie McTell tune about they got me accused of forgery and I can't even write my name. Accused of murder and never killed a man. Yeah. But you've got a huge mob that is following them. So here he's being dragged by the police away from the field. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of people that are there, an angry mob. Here's somebody that's killed a policeman. Right. So when he's being asked to sign a confession, if you don't and we turn you loose, they're out there waiting for you, and you're not going to get a trial.
That's the sweating them out thing that we talked about in the last episode.
So there it all goes, and you've got a judge who just is ready to hang him without a jury if he has to do it.
Yeah. Let me add something to that. I want to talk about the way the news, the media, we talk about the news being slanted today. But, in your book, once again, historian Dave Greer writes Death Cell Rescue. If you haven't seen it, Death Cell Rescue is an amazing account through his investigations and research. But one of the headlines was simply painting Mr. Freeman as already the guilty party. Let's just call it is, right? And the headline in and of itself was just pretty much, being described, I think it described Freeman as colored slayer of William G. Horn, motorcycle officer.
Oh yeah, you've been convicted in the papers before you have a chance to go get convicted in trial.
Which I find that interesting because we typically think of the media being less biased previous to now, maybe 20, 30 years ago. But then you look at these these headlines of what was taking place then, and it's worse.
Oh, and they describe the alleged
Physique and
defendant as a monster and all sorts of colored language.
right.
But there we go, and that's the first trial, and it goes up, and the Court of Appeals affirms that the conviction, and there's the defendant is sitting in a death cell, waiting to be taken down to sit in the electric chair and be executed. Thinks it's going to be December 30th. The appeal gets an extension, so it lasts a little longer. In the spring of the next year, the Court of Appeals affirms the thing, so he gets a new death date. And you know, there's a wonderful little thing on one of these TV shows of a guy who's on death row that makes the point of, we all know we're going to die, but none of us know when. And to have somebody tell you, you're going to die, and it's going to be at noon 2 weeks from today,
Right.
that's a whole different feeling about
That's amazing.
facing death.
Yeah.
So this guy had to do that twice. Goes up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court of Ohio, based on the arguments made by John Jetton, the black attorney who represented this guy and was not paid a nickel, who went to Columbus, visited him on death row frequently, held his hand, became his friend, which happens in these cases where you get a bonding between lawyer and the defendant.
Right.
And based on his arguments, the Supreme Court says, no, this guy really should have another trial. I mean, there's enough here. You could have had a manslaughter, you could have had a lower degree of murder, and certainly what the judge did was just outrageous.
I want to add on to that because I know that no judge likes to be overturned and reversed on appeal. It happens. And I would imagine that this was Judge Patterson. Is that his name? He was not very happy when he got reversed on appeal.
He wasn't happy, but he sure was articulate because he raised hell about the whole Supreme Court ought to be disbarred and on and on and on. He made quite a hue and cry and criticized the Supreme Court of Ohio for the outrage of not executing this man. It comes back, and happily, a new judge is assigned to the case.
I want to be more specific, though, what Patterson said about, he actually believed Freeman did receive a fair and impartial trial and indicated that Freeman was part of that herd of immigrants that has so frequently disturbed the peace and quiet of our city. He came from the South and is just another one of that group that has caused such a sense of shame to come to the reputable colored people of Dayton.
Nothing like being tarred with a broad brush.
No, nothing like it. Nothing like it.
Yeah. The sad thing about the reversal is John Jetton, who made it all happen, the lawyer who should get all the accolades, dies of cancer before the second trial begins. So he's no longer there to try the case. The NAACP brings in Albert Scher, a great criminal defense lawyer with a long history in Dayton of fantastic trials. He was the county prosecutor for a while, succeeded by Charlie Brennan, who was the prosecutor in the first trial here and the second trial as well. But it comes back for a retrial, and in the midst of the trial, the judge has a separate hearing of this whole issue of whether the confession was properly taken.
Right.
Albert Scher had been a court reporter before he became a judge. We have a judge on this court who was a court reporter before he, Dick Skelton.
That's right.
Was a court reporter, became a judge. And he was able to read the notes of the guy who took down the confession. And there were notes that were crossed out, and there were notes that did not appear in the confession they made him sign. And so he had those weaknesses put out, and we had this story of the lynch mob outside the police headquarters.
And in fact, the confession, I don't believe, was even ever read to Roy Freeman.
Right. He just signed what they told him to sign.
What they told him to sign.
Yeah. And denied that he had ever really confessed to anything. The other thing that happened is in the first trial, Mr. Pappas had testified that before the first shot was fired, he'd heard this, "Hold up your hands or I'm going to kill you." And he attributed that to Mr. Freeman. In the second trial, under cross-examination by Mr. Sherry, he said, "Well, maybe that was the policeman that was saying that." It's kind of odd to think of a guy who's in Mr. Freeman's position say, "Hold up your hands."
Right. Yeah.
That's not very likely. So it ends up with the new judge throwing out the confession, and the case goes out with the confession. And I expect Mr. Freeman made it back to your hometown about as fast as anybody ever. A lot faster. He went from south to north.
Oh my goodness. And more on that confession too. He shot, I don't believe he received any medical treatment when he got shot in the leg.
No, so he's there with his leg
He's
bleeding
dead
with
his
a bullet.
leg. That's a very important fact, I think, that his leg is bleeding while he's being interrogated. So we've gone backwards quite a bit through this podcast and just seeing the similarities and the parallels from 1900 when Moses Jones here to this case, the desegregation cases, this whole sense of are you where you're supposed to be with the desegregation cases and the work that Moses Jones did, and then here essentially the police encounter and interaction with Mr. Freeman is exactly that. And I look at it from a perspective of this is also pre-Miranda. This is Terry versus Ohio. Yes, we have obviously the Constitution, and then of course. But are you surprised that the motion to suppress was granted and the confession was thrown out, even in this time period? Because I'll be honest, I just pretty much assumed all the judges were just going to let, these judges were predominantly white in this area. We're just going to say, hey, we're just going to let it go at this time period.
I suppose the case teaches two things of great significance.
Absolutely.
One is judges are human.
Absolutely.
And that means they have biases. And it's the luck of the draw.
Yeah.
And the judge who suppressed the confession here gave quite an eloquent explanation of why he did what he did. Certainly more readable than Judge Patterson's screaming about the incompetence of the Ohio Supreme Court. But the other thing that these cases teach you is the amount of courage it takes to do your job.
Absolutely. I can only imagine the kind of threats that were coming potentially his way, that judge who reversed or who kept out the confession.
The judge and the lawyer. I mean, Jetton, pretty impressive performance, it seems to me.
And similar to Moses Jones, and I brought this up on the Moses Jones episode, doing your job as a lawyer under this climate, knowing that your life potentially is in danger, not just your clients, but yours. People today chastise defense attorneys just for doing their job. It doesn't matter who you are. If you're representing Jeffrey Dahmer or whomever, people are going to say, why are you representing that person? Or whomever, you throw that name in there. But they have the right to be represented. Somebody has to, right?
Somebody has to do it. Nobody ever gets mad at a doctor if they fix a broken bone for a bum like me.
Right.
But the same time, it's hard for people to distinguish the lawyer from the lawyer's client.
Yeah.
And it's too bad because what a lawyer is really doing is representing society, representing the system. Yeah. And the system only works when people stand up and be counted and do what they're supposed to do.
Yeah. The back to the confession, and I thought that I just pulled out some nuggets that were written from the decision from the confession by Judge Bell, who granted Scherer's motion to suppress. The general rule of law is that confessions are presumed to be involuntary, and the burden is upon the person producing them to prove that they are voluntary. The rule in this state is one of the few exceptions in this country to that general rule, the rule here being that a confession is presumed to be voluntary until the contrary is shown. I just find that fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah. He also added into his decision about the crowd making statements that the defendant ought to be hung or that he ought to be lynched. And at the time those statements were made, the defendant was within hearing distance of this persons. So not only is he being threatened with the potential of, you better give this confession up or I'm going to throw you to this mob out here, but just actually hearing the mob in the background, I couldn't imagine.
Well, and the other thing that was going on that ride from the Dayton State Hospital field to police headquarters was, it's pretty clear that he was being given a pretty good beating by the police.
Right.
And, you know, that sounds bad, but it's understandable. I mean, it's their brother has been killed, and they're going to be angry about that. And emotions fly. Yeah. But here you've been scared to death, running away from somebody who's, I mean, there were 6 bullets in the gun. All 6 were fired. One that went through Horn's heart, and he lived long enough to fire the other 5 bullets at the running defendant.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll just say about that, Judge, you talk about, you know, the difficulties in making these tough decisions, particularly in this time period. But you wrote, it takes courage, clear intellect, and impartial perspective, and an impervious disregard for criticism to make a good judge. I thought that was very, very, very well said. I mean, that's exactly what it takes. You know. That's
why I never became one. I never tried to become one.
Yeah, it has. It's not easy, but it's also it's one that does garner criticism. It does, but it does. You do have to have intellect, obviously, and be impartial and be fair. You have to love people and understand people as well. You know. So now we have to move forward to present day, and you've had the opportunity to represent people, obviously, post this incident and murder cases and trials. I'll start with you from a litigator's perspective. You know, and relating it here today. How do you view this case with your lens as a practitioner?
My hero in this, I love Albert Scher, and he was still practicing, believe it or not, when I started to practice.
Yeah. And what about him? What did you love so much about him?
He had the common touch. Mm-hmm. You know, when he was prosecuting attorney before the time of this, he gave an interesting speech where he talked about the prosecuting attorney's job is not to lock everybody in society away. Mm. It's to try to see that people can become citizens,
right,
whether they've committed a misdeed or not. You don't hear many prosecutors talk like that.
Not at all. I don't think I've ever heard that.
And in fact, you don't hear many judges talk like that. You go from then to now. I mean, 1927, we had the 3rd Street Jail was the county jail. It was a relatively small building. Mm-hmm. Now look at the jail, the county jail we have now. It covers like 3 city blocks.
Yeah, right.
It seems to me the greatest crisis we have in our criminal justice system now is the lock 'em up concept.
Yeah.
If you really sorted out all the bodies that are in prisons today, there are a number of them that are monsters that deserve to be the Charlie Mansons of the world, crazy people. And there are a number of those.
Yeah.
But they're the very small number.
And some I think most people don't realize that 90+% of the people that are sent to prison, guess what? They're going to get released. They're going to get out. So I don't think people understand that.
And the other thing people don't understand is not only are they going to get out someday, but the longer the sentence, the less hope there is that they'll ever acclimate themselves to society. It's like being in the military where you've got a regimented life where every day at X o'clock you're going to have breakfast, every day you're going to have lunch at the same time, every day you're going to go back to your cell, you're going to spend all this time by yourself.
Right.
You know, the solitary confinement makes people go crazy.
Yeah.
And they should have learned that long ago. You know, when Dickens came to the United States in 1842, he was, of course, interested in criminal justice and prisons and that sort of thing. And before the 19th century, there weren't very many prisons.
Right.
You gave somebody a whipping or cut off a hand or did something like that.
Right.
But he came over, there was this very modern prison in Philadelphia, and he wanted to see what it was like. And what they did in that prison was they locked everybody in a solitary cell, gave them a Bible, and then put a pan full of food in at the beginning of the day and took a pan full of excrement out at the end of the day. And all of those people, within a matter of months, went crazy.
Yeah.
And they've had that problem with solitary confinement in modern penology.
You're speaking like a true defense lawyer, I'll say that.
Well, we're all colored by the element in which we work.
I know.
Can't help it.
The prosecutors who may be listening to this are like, man, who is this guy?
Yeah, what's wrong with that guy?
This guy. But, talk about trials.
Bleeding heart, yeah.
You talk about trials. You talk about the trial lawyer's stress comes from the demands of concentration and focus. People just see trials on TV and just think, oh, you're just up there just asking questions and making arguments. But I don't, from a guy who's played a lot of sports and active and engaged, trials take a lot out of you. I mean, and you write in ordinary work or leisure, there is time for the mind to wander, to turn a deaf ear to conversation, to entertain a fleeting daydream. A trial lawyer has to focus on every word spoken in court and also be ready to seize upon any word that might be used to his client's advantage. Once a word is spoken, it vanishes into the air unless captured in the mind's net. I just love that because that's the truth. I mean, I've never been more exhausted after trying cases just because you were so on 12.
Yeah, it is. There is no chance to blink.
Yeah.
And unless you've done it, you have no comprehension of how much stamina and strength it takes to do it.
Right.
That's what we talked in the desegregation case when Judge Rubin decided we'd try it from 9 in the morning to 9 at night. And after a day or two of that, it's a miracle nobody got killed.
One thing that I find fascinating is the facts of the case. So we talked a little bit about we're still unsure what happened, right? No one was there. One person made it out and was able to kind of tell his story, but it wasn't his story. He later says, I think both had their hands on the gun. I think if we wanted to do our best to give a synopsis of what happened, it was more of the two were fighting over the gun. And
I think that's right.
I think that's where we all come to this.
They're wrestling off with a gun, and the gun went off.
Yeah.
And if anybody's finger was on the trigger, it had to be Patrolman Horn's because he had the gun in his hand after the shot was fired that killed him. And he's still got enough in him to shoot off the next 5 bullets. There's no way Mr. Freeman shot those last 5 bullets.
So there's 2 things I think about as well is, Miranda rights. Not at play here. Miranda's not even come into existence.
Didn't have time to do it.
Didn't have time to do it at that time. Exactly. So no Miranda rights given. And we talked a little bit about the procedure and what we motions to suppress and what should have been done at that time. But one thing I want to bring up, and through our discussions even off recording, was how things have changed. What could have made this case a little bit more concrete? And one thing I was thinking about was, what if there is, obviously today we have body cam, right? So most people say, well, pretty much, even most police officers are okay with body cameras and people can see the events unfold. And we unfortunately had to see we've seen police officers unfortunately being shot and being killed by defendants through body cam. We saw, unfortunately, George Floyd. One thing that I've learned from body cam, while they are very, very important and very, very helpful, no matter how many people view the same video, the same camera, the same thing, everyone's looking at the same thing, you're still getting people who are seeing different things. I mean, I know people who have watched, who've seen George Floyd's video over and over, and there's still folks that are pro police officer in this regard, and there's people that are pro, of course, the rights of George Floyd. So how do you think that the body camera seems to be the best, but it's also not solving things because people are going to view what they want to view?
There's no perfect solution to anything.
Right.
And of course, the classic examples are the old barroom fights where somebody gets shot or busted up, and there's a dozen witnesses, and you've got a dozen different stories of what happened.
And they're all drunk.
And they're all drunk to make it more complicated.
Right, yeah.
So we've come a long way on being able to recreate how a crime actually happened.
Right.
But we're still a long way from being able to really come to conclusion in most cases. Right. You think of the old days, well before 1927, the crimes would happen, and it's whoever is closest at hand becomes the scapegoat. Exactly, you got to find somebody that did it, and if somebody's close, well, we'll pin the tail on that donkey and work our way to the next one. And
we've seen that throughout the discussions that we've had, during that time period. Any changes that have impacted outcomes that you think are resulting from either police brutality or interactions with black men, particularly, because what I also find fascinating is the fact that these encounters have happened for hundreds of years, and here we are still talking about these police interactions, whether it be police brutality and unfortunately the killing of police officers as well. There's been a very complex, very, very complex relationship between black men and police. Would you not agree?
That's true.
Yeah, and
you think of the Cincinnati situation where you just had a kind of an out-and-out war going on. We had an out-and-out war going on in Dayton between the police and the black community before the race riots, and for months thereafter. It's too bad, and life's not easy. Problems come up and they're very hard to solve. And the only thing that makes you feel good about any of it is that there are problem solvers who have the courage to at least do what they think is the right thing to do. And there are other problem solvers who laugh their way out of it, like our friend Mr. Eichenberry.
So, Dave, in your lengthy experience as a trial lawyer, as a litigator, what do you believe it takes to be a good lawyer?
Well, I suppose the quick answer is luck.
Okay.
When I started practice, my father died real young, and so I inherited his practice, and I had a lot of cases to try. Almost all the rest of the trial bar in this town were 30 years older than I was.
Been there.
And their personalities covered the whole range, from the meanest son of a bitch in America to the nicest human being that ever taught a Sunday school class. I guess if I were to single out some factor that's important, empathy, trying to see things through the eyes of your client, trying to see things through the eyes of your opponent, try to see things through the eyes of the judge and the jury. Just to have they're human skills. They're not stuff you learn in law school.
Right.
So I think that's important. The other is, we talked about stamina. We talked about having the courage to stand up and be counted. Yeah. It's a tough business. Yeah. It's just no question about that, but it sure is a lot of fun.
It is. I wouldn't trade it for the world. Well, what do you think, man? This is our last episode, our last one.
How sad. I thought we'd end up being happy today talking about her.
I know.
Now we're ready to shed a tear.
Now we are ready to shed a tear. History seems to be repeating itself, but it's been so important to go through these cases, and I'm just honored to be able to sit down with you, break a lot of these stories down, these legal issues down, and just talk about how great of a practice we are in. And I think that our practice is going to be in good hands with those coming, and I'm hopeful they'll be able to review this and watch this and continue to push on.
Well, you're the one with honor in front of his name, and you certainly earned it thus far. And God bless you to have somebody on the bench who is willing to exercise empathy and try to do the right thing.
Right.
Whatever that turns out to be in any given case, more power to you.
Well, this has been great. I hope you all have enjoyed Dayton Retrial Podcast. We have just been decoding Dayton legal history. It's been fantastic. It's been a lot of fun. I want to keep doing it. I want us to, I always say I didn't grow up in Dayton. I came here in 2007 to start my practice, and I love this city. I won't let anybody talk bad about this city because Dayton got something to say. And we want to thank everyone who's been with us these 6 episodes. I hope you've learned something. Please continue to rate us, review us, tell us how we're doing. Once again, if you don't like what we're doing, start your own podcast, and we're going to talk about your podcast too. But Huge thanks to Dayton Bar Association, the Dayton Bar Foundation, which this whole series was done in part and funded partly from the Dayton Legal Heritage Foundation of the Dayton Foundation, as well as the Jack W. and Sally D. Eichelberger Foundation of the Dayton Foundation. We thank them so much for supporting us. Dave Greer, you're an icon. I'm honored that I've been able to sit down with you, and hopefully we can continue to do this on, man. Appreciate it.
Been a lot of fun.
Been a lot of fun. This is a 6-episode pilot podcast, and with your support, we can find funding for future episodes. Support us by subscribing, leaving a review, and comment.